In a day and age where it's possible to fake all kinds of things in photos with all the neat programs that are out there, it's hard to know what's real and what isn't. There are, however, some real photos that'll leave you staring at them for ages. Check out these 5 unbelievable photos we dare you to see. Before we begin, make sure you hit that subscribe button to get notified every day for more amazing content. With that being said, let's begin. Number 5. A train shredded after a boiler explosion, 1865. One look at this and you'll wonder what in the world could have happened to this steam locomotive. If you're not up to speed on what a steam locomotive is and how it worked, we'll bring you up to speed. The steam-era railroad locomotive was basically a giant water boiler sitting on a wheeled carriage. Directly beneath the boiler is what's called a firebox, where wood or coal was shoveled and kept burning, which heated the giant cylindrical water tank above it. The water boiling in the sealed cylinder produced steam pressure, which operated a shaft that pushed a long horizontal bar. That bar is attached to the drive wheels on each side of the locomotive, usually 6 to 8 wheels, and as the bars moved, they turned the wheels. If you consider the steam pressure that the locomotive used to pull its load and overcome the weight of the whole train, you'll get an idea of just how much pressure was building up inside of one of these tanks. On the morning of March 18, 1912, in the city of San Antonio, Texas, people were just starting a new day. Sitting outside of the Southern Pacific Roundhouse, steam locomotive number 704, which was a modern 10-wheeler passenger engine, was being prepared for its regular service. Incidentally, the train had been involved in a wreck on December 8, 1911, and repairs on the train had just been completed. Number 704 was needed to run this evening, and so the order to warm her up was given. The engineer, a helper, and the most experienced train man in the yard was moving aboard and around the locomotive making adjustments, checking fittings, and performing general preparation for the train to move out of the yard. Many men were working in shops that were located on both sides of where the locomotive was sitting and warming up and building pressure. Control of the amount of pressure was critical in the boiler. Valves were developed to pop and release pressure if there was a problem, but if pressure built too quickly, the crown plate of the boiler might fail to contain it, and that is exactly what happened. In an instant, the boiler began to split at its bottom. The iron bars supporting the crown plate of the boiler failed, and the pressure was catastrophically released. The drive wheels of the train were snapped from their hubs, and the boiler broke from its carriage and launched the multi-ton cylinder into the sky. The pressure wave and debris destroyed the surrounding shops, which were literally blown to pieces, including the people who were near the locomotive, and some were even disintegrated. Number 4. A Mongolian woman immured. The world has seen many photos like this one, but it's possible that not many people have seen this particular photo. The story behind it is interesting, and gives us an idea of what things were like in an era which has long since passed us. This photograph was taken in 1913 by a French photographer by the name of Albert Kahn, who was a millionaire banker who incidentally pioneered color photography. That process was actually invented by the Lumiere brothers. Albert Kahn was traveling the world and taking photographs wherever he could and had been to many exotic countries. One of those countries was Mongolia, where he happened upon a woman that was locked inside of a crate and was condemned to a slow and painful sentence of starvation. The crate itself is out in the remote desert where there's no one around to interfere. Sometimes a passerby would come along, but they would either have little or no food, or wouldn't go near the crate for fear of ending up in a crate themselves. If you look at the photo, you'll notice the empty bowls on the ground. According to the story, those bowls had water in them which were not refilled intentionally as to increase the suffering of the person inside the crate. The photo was published in a 1922 issue of National Geographic, which they entitled Mongolian Prisoner in a Box. Immurement, by the way, is a form of punishment where a person is put inside a box or a crate, and the punishment is usually for life. You're probably wondering by now why the woman was put in the crate to begin with. The claim made by the National Geographic publishers was that their crime was adultery. Immurement was a punishment that was practiced in Mongolia. It's not known what happened to the woman in the box, but it likely became her tomb. Albert Kahn, who made the photograph, was unable to interfere and had to leave her in the box. Unknown to many is that there exists a prime directive of anthropologists in which they cannot intervene with another culture's laws. That prime directive sounds familiar. Number 3. The last photograph of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. I don't know if I got the lich right. It'd be safe to say that everyone knows who the Russian Communist Revolutionary was. He was the head of the Soviet Union from 1922 till 1924. Under Lenin, Russia and the larger Soviet Union became a one-party communist state. Lenin was a Marxist who developed political theories known as Leninism. He was widely considered one of the most influential and significant figures of the 20th century. So, what's the story about the photo? Well, the story begins on August 30th in 1918, in which Lenin survived an assassination attempt by a socialist revolutionary and would-be killer, 28-year-old Fanny Kaplan, or sometimes Dora Kaplan. However, it might be worth noting that there are many problems with the story surrounding the assassination and the one who actually pulled the trigger. Fanny Kaplan looked to be set up as a martyr, but was simply executed not long after and burned so that nothing remained of her. It's a bad story, but a lot of bad things were happening during this time. In fact, this was the second assassination attempt on his life. Lenin was about to get into his car as he was leaving the hammer and sickle factory in Moscow where there was a meeting. Kaplan called out his name and pulled out a revolver and fired 3 shots. One of the shots missed him, but the other 2 hit their mark. One went through his neck and the other into his left shoulder. The photo in question is the last photo of Lenin that would be taken while he was alive. Seen in a wheelchair with his sister Anna Ilyich Leonova and his doctor A.M. Kozinginov, Lenin appears to have a piercing and wild stare as the photographer snaps the photo. Lenin previously suffered 3 strokes in the previous 2 years after the assassination attempt. The look on his face could very well be from the strains of leading the revolution, fighting a civil war, and, of course, the wounds he received from the attempted assassinations. He was unable to speak and had no ability to move his right side. It was the 3rd stroke that happened on March 10, 1923, which took away his ability to speak permanently and ended his political work. Lenin was mute and remained bedridden until his death on January 21, 1924 at the age of 53. Number 2. Ella Harper, the Camel Girl. Some sources say that Ella Harper was born in Tennessee around the year 1870, despite conflicting reports. Ella was born with a very unusual orthopedic condition which resulted in her knees being bent backwards. This unusual and unknown affliction is very rare, and it's quite unknown. Some modern doctors would call this condition an advanced form of congenital genorecurvatum, or back knee deformity. Because of the unusual bent knees, along with her preference of walking on all fours, probably because it was much easier on her, she earned the nickname, or moniker if you will, the Camel Girl. In 1886, Ella was a big star in a circus called W.H. Harris's Nickel Plate Circus. She was often accompanied by a live camel, so people could see the resemblance of her knees to a camel's knees. Things were definitely a lot different back in those days. Newspapers were calling her the most wonderful freak of nature since the creation of the world. Apparently, the world then was considered a freak of nature, but I digress. Camel Girl was a pretty popular attraction, and she didn't seem to mind being called a freak or showing up in the circus. She was paid $200 a week, which back then was a lot of money by today's standards. She had a pitch card that spoke about why she's called the Camel Girl and that she walks best on her hands and feet. She spoke about how she traveled a lot and intends to quit show business and go to school. However, little is known about her life when she left the circus. What's known from records is that she returned home to Summer County, Tennessee. She lived with her mother, and then on June 26, 1905, she was married to a Robert L. Savely. In 1906, a year later, she gave birth to a daughter, who sadly died in November of that same year. The interesting thing is that in 1918, they adopted another baby girl who died at less than 3 months old. The only other record after this is that she died December 19, 1921 in Nashville of colon cancer. She was buried in Spring Hill Cemetery. Number 1. Lord Combermere's ghost photo. The last photo on our list is a photo of a ghost. As many of you know, there are a ton of photos like this floating around online, and while the majority are proven bogus or fake, there are some photos that couldn't be faked because of the time period and the equipment, or could they? A photographer by the name of Sybil Corbet took a photo in the beautifully historic Combermere Abbey Library clear back in 1891. A little while before Photoshop was invented. In the photo, you can see what appears to be a man sitting in a chair. You can just make out the man's head and his arm resting on the armrest of the chair. When staff saw the photo, they were surprised and claimed that it looked like the late Lord Combermere. The abbey is located in Cheshire, England, and was founded in 1133 by Benedictine monks. The place became the seat of Sir George Cotton, Vice Chamberlain to the household of Prince Edward, who was the son of Henry VII. Long story short, Sir Stephen Cotton was a descendant who took the name or title Lord Combermere and ended up being the governor of Barbados because of a distinguished military service. Unfortunately, he ended up dying after being run down by a horse-drawn carriage in 1891. The photographer, Sybil Corbet, set up her camera so that the shutter was open for 1 hour in the manor's library while the whole staff was out at Lord Combermere's funeral, which, by the way, was 4 miles away. By the way, those long exposure times were necessary in the early days of photography, so leaving the shutter open for such a long time wasn't by mistake. After the plate was developed, an image of a man's head and upper torso was noticed immediately. It appears that the Lord was not at his funeral, but in his library, sitting in his chair. Some immediately thought that a servant came into the room and sat briefly in the chair, but all members of the household testified they were all at the funeral. Hope you enjoyed the video, Top 5ers. If you haven't already, check out our other channel, Americano, to enjoy even more amazing list videos. There will be a link in the description, so check it out, as well as our other cool stuff.